I don't have a well, first of all, thank you to Jayati and to Chandra for the invitation to this conference. I mean, I don't have a PowerPoint because I did finish at the UN 2 days ago. And maybe this is a reflection of the squeezing of the middle class in a post-manufacturing era. In the old days, when you retired, they gave you a clock when you retired. Today, they take away your computer when you at least in the UN. So I don't have a computer. So I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've done in UNCTAD, but also I think to reflect on something that overhangs, I think, all the discussions we have, which is the resilience of this hyper-globalized financial world. Despite the fact that it has been characterized by highly erratic boom and bust growth, highly uneven growth, despite the fact that it hasn't delivered on its one big promise, which is to boost investment, both public and private. I mean, we have a real investment crisis across large parts of this global economy, not just the South, but also in the North. And the fact that it's kept together with an inordinately high levels of indebtedness that have grown exponentially since the mid-1980s. And despite that, it's survived a number of deep shocks, in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, again during COVID. Big promises were made on both those occasions. None of those promises were delivered on. There were some minor tweaks, but no promises. The big promises that were made in London in 2009, and again after COVID, have not been delivered on. And the worry that we've had, I think, in UNCTAD for some time now, really predating COVID, is that even though we've all kind of committed to ambitious targets for both development and climate, the prospects certainly for many developing countries to 2030, when those promises are meant to come to fruition, is one of a lost decade. And I mean, I support multilateralism intrinsically, but we're not going to deliver either the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Agreement by 2030. I think if we're honest about that, we need to prepare for the fact that 2030 will not be the kind of we will not land in the kind of way that either the SDGs or the Paris Agreement would like to see. And even more recently, the last 12 months, I think, again, the resilience of the system. I mean, 12 months or 30 and 40 months ago, when we were looking at 2023 as an economy, that we were, along with many other people, we were very nervous about the prospects for last year. We had the banking tensions in the US, the worries about high interest rates and the impact that would have not only on advanced economies but on developing countries, the misguided monetary policy that had been adopted by central banks in the advanced economies to fight what essentially has been supply-side driven inflation, as people at UMass know full well, having done the research on that. But the crisis was somehow alleviated. If you were in Washington a few weeks ago, I think relief was the kind of overriding sentiment of people in Washington. But of course, relief doesn't hide these underlying problems. Investment remains weak. Trade growth is extremely sluggish. Fragmentation is increasing. And so that the resilience of the system, I think, is something progressives need to think hard about when it comes to thinking through alternative measures. One thing that we've tried to emphasize in the work that we've done in UNCTAD is, of course, the lack of coordination across the main players in this system. I'm slightly more jaundiced than Shari about the state of play. G20, which was meant to be the venue that would be more seriously delivering on these promises, just is flat out bankrupt right now. There is no coordination. There's no serious discussion of the kind of problems that Shari identified, or the solutions, I think, to those problems. And even though the US and to some extent China performed better last year than many expected, the Eurozone is still. My favorite headline from the Financial Times last week was "Germany propels Eurozone to 0.3% growth," which was presented as being some sort of triumphant outcome, which is in fact a sign of a region in very serious trouble, which the Eurozone clearly still is. Already this kind of the situation that we see is provoking familiar responses, particularly given the high levels of debt that have been accumulated in the advanced economies in response to the crisis, the COVID crisis. Ken Rogoff has returned with his warnings. I'm sure UMass people will be pleased to hear about that particular return. Talk about elevated servicing costs crowding out private investment, again, has become part of the discourse. Of course, no discussion of why diminished servicing costs for a decade after the financial crisis didn't lead to a major investment boom across the North. There's no discussion of that, but warnings that higher servicing is going to have a negative impact on particularly private investment. But of course, the debt is much more, I think, and why we're having the conference, is a much more acute problem across the developing world, and that's a problem that UNCTAD has worried about for a long time. It predates COVID. Clearly, it became particularly acute after 2015. Developing countries slowed. There was a brief period recovery after the COVID shock, but they slowed from 2014 onward quite sharply. Trade slowed down. Commodity prices diminished significantly for many markets, and already, and there was the threat of the normalization of monetary policy. The discussion of normalization of monetary policy added to nervousness of international investors, capital flight, signs of capital flight, and problems that go with that, and the failure of reform of financial governance was apparent. Promises on overseas development assistance have never been met. Credit rating agencies and the role of credit rating agencies has continued to haunt developing countries. The cost of capital, problems with the cost of capital that Shari talked about. As a consequence, insufficient concessional financing, the problem of illicit financial. None of these issues have been addressed in this period. Fantastical talk about billions to trillions, the role of blended finance, none of which has delivered finance on the kind of scale that is needed to meet the investment challenge that are discussed under the rubric of Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. And in the 2019 Trade and Development Report, we were already warning back then of a lost decade for developing countries prior to COVID. The signs were all there that increasing numbers of developing countries were under debt distress, and there was no architecture in place to handle the problem. And I think that was you, Daniel, did a calculation looking at just at the first 4 Sustainable Development Goals: poverty reduction, hunger, education, health, and the scale of investment that would be required in the developing world to meet those goals would require either a level of debt to GDP of 200% or more, or a growth rate in double-digit figures, neither of which were going to be delivered, clearly. And so just looking at those 4 Sustainable Development Goals told us that we're simply not on track in a meaningful way to meet the Agenda 2030. And the proposals that we made then, I guess, will be the proposals that you all discussed today. Debt relief would be essential. Increased concessional financing, regional payments arrangements. We took that from from Jan's earlier work on the importance of regional payments arrangements, the need to pump up the role of development banks as a major source of domestic resource mobilization. And of course, COVID has simply exposed, I think, the weaknesses of the system and the failures of the system from a development perspective, and none of the solutions and there were some positives, obviously, out of the COVID crisis. The allocation of special drawing rights was an important step forward. We know the problems. We know the fact that they're based on the existing voting patterns means that they don't go to the countries that need it the most. But it was certainly a positive. There was some change in IMF facilities to make credit allocation less concessional, more rapid. These are positives. The DSSI and the common framework simply are they're sticking plasters over a much deeper problem. They don't solve the systemic problem of unsustainable debt. The vaccine and the WTO situation was even worse in many respects in terms of helping developing countries. And even the response to climate shocks has not, I mean, the loss and damage initiative was an important initiative that developing countries fought hard for, first of all in Sharm el-Sheikh and then successfully last year in Dubai. But so far, I think this was, I don't know what the figure is, I think it's 750 million has been delivered to meet a problem which is estimated already in excess of $100 billion per year in terms of loss and damage to climate shocks in developing countries. The Americans promised $17 million to the loss and damage fund. So the idea that they are committed to some sort of multilateral response to financing problems, I'm highly skeptical of that, even if Biden gets back in November, which I don't know if he will or not. So from our point of view, and again, just to reinforce Shari's point, the talk in Washington is that we simply face a liquidity crisis, that this is a liquidity crisis. We can muddle through the problems as they emerge in Zambia or Ghana or Senegal or wherever else they surface. For us, this is a development. It's not simply debt distress that worries us. It's development distress. When countries are spending more on debt servicing than on health and education, then we know that the rudiments of a successful development strategy are simply not in place. And with interest rates remaining higher for longer, without a shadow of doubt, austerity will be back on the policy agenda across much of the developing world over the coming years, again, at the expense of meeting either the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Agreement. And the alternatives, I guess, is what we'll talk. I mean, a sovereign debt workout. I have to keep mentioning it. A sovereign debt workout mechanism was UNCTAD's solution to the debt crisis in the 1980s. The IMF picked it up briefly, and it was very rapidly kicked into touch by U.S. Treasury, but not only U.S. Treasury, and many developing countries were, of course, themselves skeptical of it because of the potential reputational effect it might have. So it's not just the U.S. that opposed it, but we would argue without that kind of mechanism, the kind of financial stress that developing countries face will stop them making the investments that they need to meet their development ambitions. We've argued recently the need for a debtors club, that developing countries need to get together to share experiences and to club together to push for alternative options in the debt space. I was with Jamie Galbraith a couple of days ago, actually, and he can't believe that developing countries are not going on what he calls a collective debtors strike. Why don't developing countries default in the 21st century? I mean, what is the pressure on them to avoid the default option? I think it's a complicated question, but I think it's a one that this this meeting needs to think about. And of course, we've offered soft solutions in the form of principles of responsible borrowing and lending. But even those soft principles have been resisted by the advanced economies. We worked with Argentina in 2014, 2015 to advance those in the context of the UN General Assembly. We were successful in getting them, but they've made absolutely no difference in terms of framing the debt challenge facing developing countries. So I think the power question remains firmly in place, and I think unless the developing world gets together and forges a more solidaristic stance around these issues, I think resilience of the hyper-globalized financial world will continue to disappoint in terms of development outcomes. So, thank you.